when things come together that are what keeps us going in the meantime. We've totally broken our flow of worship, just to name that entirely. Like that's where, for the record, Oscar Rain has now seemed to stop outside. So we're jumping back in, and I just want to acknowledge that we're totally out of that space. We're in a new space. We are just figuring this out. So thank you for bearing with us. To me, this really speaks to what the Loving Community really is, because it's not in our plans, it's not in our structures and our institutional things. It's our coming together when things go unexpectedly. If you'll bear with me then, I'd like to return to Frederick Hosmer, that I so briefly was chatting about. Frederick Hosmer, minister in this congregation in the 1880s. I think it was 1878 to 1892. So definitely a formative part of this congregation's participation in liberal religious culture that was extremely powerful, extremely potent. But I wanted to note that I'm really using Hosmer as a standing there. He's a convenient individual who's connected to this congregation. But of course, I have no idea what he believed personally. I'm just imagining what a religious progressive, somebody like Frederick Hosmer, what would Frederick Hosmer have thought about God at the end of the 19th century? And what I'm suggesting is that he probably imagined God in a way that we actually haven't gotten to in this series, and that was a little intentional. Because it is so much a part of this heritage of America in the late 19th century. This God that animated liberal religion back then was very much like the God that informed the American Revolution. Like, if you want to think about this God, this was the God who created the universe. This was the God who lay behind values and virtues in society. This was the God of freedom and truth and the pursuit of happiness and inalienable rights and this sort of this kind of a God. But the thing to note is that this God is also very much removed from day-to-day life. This is not a God who is participating in the world. The classical definition, if we want to get all formal about it, for this model is deism. Deism describes the God of philosophers like Voltaire or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These people who imagine God sort of like a clockmaker. A God who created the gears, set everything in motion, but then stepped away once it had been wound up. And we as people are kind of left to our devices. Of course, just to note, this still was a powerful form of spirituality in the late 19th century. This was the motivation of the abolitionist movement. This was the motivation of all kinds of social justice work that happened because the idea was that God had told us what the world ought to be, and we ought to work to make it that way. But spiritually, that's a rough connection to make to a God who's a watchmaker, who doesn't particularly care or invest God's self in the world. I sort of imagine this God is a little bit like an absentee Victorian father. So like the dad from Mary Poppins is who I'm thinking of. This God sort of provides for us, and he sort of loves us in this notional kind of a way. But this is an absentee dad. I guess in this analogy, Earth is like boarding school. But you get the idea. So faith in this God was less about meaningful belief. It was so much more about the moral dicta, the things that we knew we were supposed to do in the world to make the world that God had intended it to be. Again, that's where those social justice movements come from. That's where there are real powerful things that were fueled through this way of thinking about God. Worth also knowing the abolitionist movement also. Also the anti-alcohol movement was also fueled by this. So, all good things. So those good things being one part of it, I think we can also agree that an upper-class Victorian-era father is not necessarily a model for either fathers or gods that we will hold on to. If you're going to suppose God exists, you might as well have that God do more than write some moral precepts that he's hidden like a word search in some dusty old books. I'm getting into all this background because This week's God, the God that is in everything, the God that we're talking about today, really is the exact opposite of that point of view. And it's really remarkable that the UU heritage is connected in this way, that it could begin in this very distant vision of God. And now I would say the one that is most natural to our heritage and kind of where our own thinking is at as a denomination is really this God that evolves, this God that is dynamic, this God that is immanent with us in a much, much different way. It's partially because of that heritage that I think this idea is so important, one that we should really hold on to. It also allows us to rethink our own models about spirituality. And if you'll forgive me continuing along, I know the idea of God as Father is a fraught image, but if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I think the God that is in everything, the God that is dynamic, that is in process, that is in change. Maybe instead of that old Victorian father, this model allows us to imagine God a little bit more like a T-ball coach dad. Less removed, less out there in the universe. This is the dad who's right there with you. He helps you swing the bat, even when you can't quite make connection. And if you're too scared, you're not really ready for it, he'll just run the bases with you. You can think of this as the God who carries the bag of orange slices wherever he goes. The idea that God might be present and close is, of course, very old. But the more specific way, this idea of thinking about God's continued participation in the world, so that God's work is always in process, that's actually quite recent. And it was an idea specifically meant to answer for that old deistic God that so many people have come to imagine. Just a little history here, just dipping in a little bit. Panentheism was an early term for it. It was coined by the theologian Paul Tillich, and he would describe an indwelling God who was present and participated in creation. In fact, his whole idea was that creation was always ongoing and that we were always co-creators alongside that God. Later innovators would take Tillich's idea and knit it to even newer ideas. Philosophy and philosophers had spent centuries obsessed with the idea of being. It was all about state. It was all about existence. But new thinking, new ideas were coming around that were thinking, instead of a static idea like being, what about a process like becoming? Suppose God becomes alongside of us. So I'd say for our purposes, maybe an easier way to think about this is a God who is spirit. And by that I mean like a capital S, spirit.
Sound effects.
Down on the guys are bowling.
Apparently, we really like that to be a great. Spirit is a loaded term, I know, and I'm intentionally walking a very careful line between, a charismatic Pentecostal idea of spirit on one hand, and a German philosopher talking about spirit on the other hand. I'm imagining something kind of in the middle. Suppose that God is in everything, and that we can engage with this God as spirit when it indwells and habitates. This is a spirit that can inhabit your heart, but also who can move in your guts and make you feel things that are normally supposed to operate only in your brain. This spirit, in the words of theologian Catherine Keller, is gift and fire and breath and flow and flame. I've said before in worship that I think one of the most important things a congregation like ours has to offer the world, other than, of course, your care and service, is the lived-out message of universalism. Universalism is a profound, unthinkably prophetic idea, and it's one that our struggling world needs to hear. And strictly speaking, that idea is about people and their dignity and connection to one another and to the world. But maybe there's also the mirror image of that idea that's just as crucial, where dignity is only about the people, but our interconnectedness, and the idea that web that connects us extends even to moments and ideas and other intangible things. Maybe there's a version of universalism that's about God or the sacred or spirit being present in all things, enduring in all things, imbuing every aspect of the world with grace and goodness if only we care to see it. Of course, this is a new model for understanding God, so we have to reshape how we understand the world that might be connected in this way. In particular, it brings the idea of holiness into the day-to-day, ordinary, very mundane parts of our world. When we think about it in kind of an old model, that old deistic model, holiness is this unique and profound thing that only touches, these unique and rare individuals who are always otherworldly in their holiness. I'm thinking of your Buddhas, your Moseses, your Gandhis, your St. Francises, the saints and sages. But if God is in everything, holiness doesn't touch the occasional person. It emerges from the world around us. So when we consider these gifts, we see that it's the poor, the peaceful, those who come together. Those are the people who make up the stuff of holiness. If God lives in holy men and women, perhaps God dwells in their eyes, a reflection of the attention that they are paying to the way God works in the world. In that version, to be holy turns into our openness, our readiness to see this way in which God lives and breathes and moves among us each moment, in each detail. When I was a kid, I had a very polarized relationship to how clean my room was. As an 11-year-old boy, mostly it was a cluttered mess, like most kids. On any given day, I'd have a half dozen glasses of water, who knew where they came from. There'd be papers and books, music, all kinds of just junk around. But sometimes I'd get into this perfectionist fit. I would need all the clutter to be gone from my life. I need to organize myself in an intentional way. And I discovered, or invented, one or the other, the biggest, most lazy cheat if you are trying to clean things up. Maria Kondo would not appreciate this. I would get a big box, like a carton-sized moving or storage box, and I would just put all my junk and clutter in it. And then I just put it in my closet. And suddenly my room would be clean. And I would be in this wonderful minimalist space. It was wonderful. Of course, the dilemma was that I hadn't cleaned up anything. I just consolidated it and saved it for later. I learned that you could store your mess. As a result, unintentionally, those boxes became like an archaeology of my life. Like I had stored parts of myself, parts of my life in these boxes that I would rediscover years later. This included small stuff and big stuff, all the stuff that makes up young life, spelling tests, book reports, school awards, stuffed animals, yearbooks, broken pencils, souvenirs, whatever, junk. Suppose God lives in those boxes. Suppose the clutter of a child's room were sacred vessels, testimony to the stuff of life that we would realize is miraculous if only we could see how truly extraordinary a child's toy is against the vastness of the universe. Suppose how sacred we would understand our own lives to be if we could discover it like an ancient treasure or unearth it in a moment of discovery like we'd never seen it before. The gift of grace, the breath of life, the flow, the flame, the sacred. The God who is in everything is not far away in some heaven. This divine spirit can be found in the ordinary parts of our lives, participating in our joys and our sorrows, our griefs, our triumphs, but also in our most ordinary moments and our most forgettable days. This is a God who doesn't have a heaven to retreat to, and so builds a home in our hearts. Having said that last part, come think of it, I think this is a pretty cheesy God, to be honest. Or maybe a better way to say it is that this is a God that isn't afraid of being a little cheesy. I imagine this is a God who's not going to shy away from simple spiritualities or naive pieties, if that's what people are at. This is the God who isn't afraid to show up in a chicken soup for the soul book or appear in a child's prayer. But if that's true, this is also a God that doesn't shy away from our struggles and the impossible moments that we sometimes face. I think the God who is in everything is humble enough to meet us in our grief and suffering. If the deist God turned away from seeing the evils of the world, leaving us to our own devices, the God who is in everything finds us in tears and sits down next to us to cry as well. We began by speculating about the God of Frederick Hosmer and other liberal religious figures from the past. For most of human history, religion was a mark of identity, and it was part of who you were to worship in the way that your ancestors did. Now, I'm exactly the kind of person who still finds that kind of piety beautiful and profound, so I have a great deal of respect for that kind of religious expression. But Unitarian Universalism has as its heritage a regard for learning and development and process and change. And that's why this God who is in everything has perhaps a great deal to say to our current moment in our contemporary worlds. Because this is a God who is ready for change and invites contradiction and paradox. This is not a God who demands faith or is offended by disbelief. To analogize this God, some theologians refer to a luminous darkness to describe the idea that we might be still enlightened and comforted in faith, even if God exists for us in our uncertainty and mystery. And perhaps that's just what we need now, in a world that feels at times to be cast further and further into shadow. Perhaps we live in an age where faith is not so much a light to the world. Perhaps it's a comforting hand to hold no matter how dark it gets. Perhaps the God who is in everything is not here to help us get back to where we were. Perhaps the God who is in everything can help us to become the better thing that we're all struggling to become.
Our closing hymn is number 1066 in the Teal hymnal. The words are in your order of service, but if yours got lost like mine did, there are hymnals in front of you too. Please stand as you're willing and able.
I want you all to be seated. The word benediction technically means to speak a good word, to say something good. I found this good word from Rainer Maria Rilke. So if you'll bear with a little poetry this morning. The hour is striking so close above me, so clear and sharp, that all my senses ring with it. I feel it now. There's a power in me to grasp and give shape to my world. I know that nothing has ever been real without my beholding it. All becoming has needed me. My looking ripens things, and they come toward me to meet and be met. I thank you all for what to me has been an especially holy day, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of yours.
All right. Well, thank you for all of your talents.
That's right. I like that.